Meet William Henry Stafford Jr., the man who fought to save the Naval Live Oaks Reservation in Gulf Breeze, Florida. William Henry Stafford Jr. was born May 11, 1931 in, Mr. Stafford, help me, Maizeri, Ohio. He received a BS from Temple University in 1953 and an LLB from Temple University School of Law in 1956, then immediately became a lieutenant, JG, in the United States Navy and served from 1956 to 1960. Somewhere in here, he managed to meet and marry Nancy, the love of his life. Following his Navy experience, he set up a private practice in Pensacola, Florida from 1961 to 1969. During his private practice, he served as Assistant City Attorney of Pensacola, Florida in 1963. He was a state attorney of First Judicial Circuit of Florida from 1967 to 1969. He was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Florida from 1969 to 1975. On April 18, 1975, President Gerald Ford nominated Stafford for federal judge on the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida. The United States Senate confirmed his appointment on May 12, 1975, and received his commission on May 14, 1975. He served as chief judge from 1981 to 1993. He assumed senior status on May 31st, 1996. Welcome.
I'm not unmindful that today is Maundy Thursday for many of the Christian denominations, and tomorrow Passover begins. So, and the weather reports are not the kind that attract tourists. So I'm grateful for all of you showing up. I'm particularly grateful for my wife, Nancy, to be here. She's heard me talk way too much for 60 years, and I'm also pleased at the coincidence of vacation bringing my niece, Barbara Bell, from Cincinnati, and her friend Victor Rodriguez, and his brother Daniel, and his friend Helen from San Antonio. So we're delighted to have them here with us tonight. Betty was kind to invite me to talk to you, or talk with you perhaps, about something that many of you probably know more about than I. You may have lived here longer. As you heard in the introduction, Nancy and I came here in the late spring of 1960. At that time I was working for State Farm Insurance, and one of my jobs was to call on an agent in Fort Walton Beach. We were living out in Navy Point area at the time, so my travels course took me through here and down that 2-lane road through a wooded area east of the little wide spot in the road called Gulf Breeze, and then coming back at night. It was pretty treacherous because it was still the same narrow road, no lights, very little striping, and I recall that seeing the hogs in the ditches off to the side on any given night. You could see their eyes glaring up at you. That I found out later on is what was the Naval Live Oaks Preservation. But that's 1960. I didn't know too much at that time. But the utility of the live oak trees in your community came to the attention of a guy by the name of John Quincy Adams. He was in the White House. And that matter was brought to President John Quincy Adams' attention, became about the time that Florida, West Florida, became a part of the United States. That was in 1821. And you remember that transfer of ownership from Spain to the United States took place right over here across the bridge in Pensacola at Plaza Ferdinand. And Collier Merrill and those people tell me that that restaurant that they own on the Plaza Ferdinand got its name because somebody was looking, what are we going to call this place? And somebody looked at the window and they saw that statue. And they said, that's where Andrew Jackson stood, so why don't we just call the restaurant Jackson's? And that is what I am told how the restaurant got its name. But there at that place, Florida, the area we know and where we are now, became part of the United States. And it merged with East Florida the next year to become Florida. And Tallahassee was selected as the capital. Now, a few years later, in 1832, there were two private owners of this land. Henry Brackenridge, who was a friend of Andrew Jackson, and Richard Keith Call. Those two men had acquired the title to the property on what we now know as the Naval Live Oaks Reservation from the Spanish owners. They got them from the Spanish owners, and then they conveyed the land to the United States. Now, this was all part of one county. But in 1842, just a few years later, Santa Rosa County was created out of Escambia County. And then Florida became a state the next year. That was in 3 years later. 1845, Florida became a state. Well, in 1869, the Santa Rosa County Courthouse in Milton burned. And all those land records, and there was no microfiche, there was no way to preserve all of those records written in hand were totally destroyed. There was no record of who owned the land. And beginning the very next year, that would have been in 1870, Samuel Gonzalez and A.E. Maxwell. If you had been to the East Hill of Pensacola, you'll recognize the names of those streets. Those two gentlemen began purchasing tax certificates. They got them from Santa Rosa County. Then they got tax deeds from the state of Florida. Because you see, Santa Rosa County and the sovereign state of Florida was absolutely delighted to get that tax money. So they gave them tax deeds. Well, in 1933, Florida ceded exclusive jurisdiction of this property to the United States and stopped collecting the taxes. But they didn't refund the money to these owners, to the heirs of Maxwell and Gonzalez. Then in 1947, a couple of years after World War II, the United States conveyed the property to the state of Florida, and the deed, and the two witnesses on the deed were Spencer Holland and Bob Sykes. And they conveyed that land to the state of Florida. This land we now know as the Naval Live Oaks Preserved. But there was a clause in there that said that the state of Florida must use this property, quote, exclusively for public park purposes, with a reverter clause giving the government the right to reclaim the title if the state did not use that land exclusively for public park purposes. But shortly thereafter, the state, through what was then called the Florida Board of Forestry and Parks, brought a lawsuit in Santa Rosa County, right here, to attempt to quiet the state's title to the land against the then owners of record. These people that held these tax deeds. The state brought them into court and wanted to quiet the title, in the state of Florida to this land. And they were, anybody who had any semblance of title under these earlier tax deeds. Well, the state won in Milton, but the case went to the Florida Supreme Court. And in 1950, that august body in Tallahassee established some law in Florida that said, Counselor, while these private claimants could not have ever brought the state into court. You know, the doctrine of sovereign immunity, the king can do no wrong. You can't sue the king. You can't sue the state of Florida. You can't sue Uncle Sam unless he consents to it. So, no way that these people could have ever sued the state of Florida, but the state sued them. So they were in court, and the Supreme Court of Florida, in a case called Daniel v. Sherrill. It's kind of an outlier out there. It's kind of a unique case. It says, in effect, these private claimants could never have brought the state into court, but once the state filed suit against them, then all parties were equal. And the state could not deny these tax deeds and other claims of title that these so-called private claimants, and you will hear that word, private claimants, referred to throughout. So there's no way that the state could disparage their title. Now, of course, the reversionary right of the United States to this land was not affected by whatever the Florida Supreme Court said. You remember? The land was conveyed to Florida, but there was, Uncle Sam said, you got to use it exclusively for public park purposes. And if you don't, Uncle Sam can come back in and claim the title back. So whatever the Florida Supreme Court said in Tallahassee didn't affect the government's interest. But as between those private claimants and the state of Florida, these private claimants had a claim. And the government's title was not affected by a decision that came out of the circuit court, because the Supreme Court of Florida sent it back to the court in Milton, the circuit court, the state court, the circuit court in Milton, and said enter an order not inconsistent with our opinion. So there it sat. The scouts in the meantime had used the property. And I don't know, looking around, how many of you were scouts here? The Boy Scouts had Camp Big Heart. And the Girl Scouts had Camp Isabella Ingraham. I think you all called it Camp Inky, did you not? Yeah, Camp Inky. And somewhere along the line, Admiral William Sinton I don't know whether any of you ever served under Admiral Sinton or not, but I had the pleasure of visiting with him one night and got some background on this. When he was commanding officer here of the Naval Education and Training, he was head of naval aviation in this area. It was during his term in that job, in that command, that a African American Boy Scout camp was started. And those scouts were so pleased that they called it Camp Sinton. So for the first time, the black young men in this community had a place to camp. And that was on the north side of the highway. So the scouts kind of controlled everything. So anybody who wanted to use this land, you remember, to be used exclusively for public park purposes. But if you wanted to use it, you had to get a permit from the scouts. So it rocked along. When the state widened US 98, that old two-lane road that we all traveled down for years, that got widened. Scouting use became limited because they moved in, they widened the road 40 feet. So the scouts acquired that land up in Walton County, where the present Boy Scout camp is. During the same period of time, no trespassing signs were put up. Remember, these private claimants were in and out of this land. There were commercial billboards on that land. This public park purpose, it had commercial billboards. And there were local businesses that advertised there. Local police. What local police were here had a pistol range out on the property. Other small businesses were attempted, including an animal park. And that was a humorous part of our proof later on. There was even some interest in placing the new University of Florida at the Naval Live Oaks. And I met Jim Reeves through J.B. Hopkins. Jim was fresh out of the Marines, and I was struggling to make a living. And J.B. Hopkins was a lawyer in town, and he had been a legislator. And when the legislature approved a new university for West Florida, there was some talk about putting it at the Naval Live Oaks Reservation. And I remember we had two newspapers at the time, either the morning paper or afternoon. There was a story about, well, we can get Bob Sykes to get the federal government to release their reverter interest, so the state can build a university out there on that 1,400 acres of land. But the inimitable and soft-spoken J.B. Hopkins bellowed from the rooftop, that university is going to be in Escambia County, no other place. So Naval Live Oaks Reservation receded into the background as a possible campus for the university. So this property, in and out of some kind of use and misuse and non-use. Finally, on February 25th, 1970, the Interior Department served notice on the state that the U.S. was exercising its right of reverter, having determined in Washington, and from the studies that they had made here, that the land indeed was not being used exclusively for public park purposes. I had become U.S. Attorney about 6 months before, in August of '69. And in the spring of 1970, a guy walks into my office, post office and courthouse downtown at Chase and Palafox Street. And he says he's from the Interior Department. He had a card. And he was sent down from Atlanta to post signs out there on this property. advising the world that the government was reclaiming land. I have to tell you a little side story. That man, and I can't remember his name, his ex-wife and children were living in Gulf Breeze. And I suspect that maybe in the office up there, they were looking for somebody to send down to West Florida, and maybe he volunteered to come down. So I thought, yeah, you're going to post a sign out there, and the government is claiming the property back, and that's what kind of piqued my interest. Well, the United States Attorney prosecutes criminal cases in federal court. We also represent the government's interest in civil matters. If a post office truck hits you, collides with you, you got to claim the U.S. Attorney represents a government interest. You know, when we want to condemn property for a new an extension of the Navy base, the U.S. Attorney handles the government interest. Social Security cases, the United States represents the interests of the United States of America in federal court, and in some cases in state court. So in criminal cases where you're prosecuting drug cases and theft of government property and hijacking and all that other stuff that comes into federal court, counterfeiting, what have you. You have the FBI, you have the Treasury Department, you have drug agents, you have all of them. But in civil cases, you have no investigators. So you're doing it yourself. So we had to find witnesses and collect the physical evidence. Now the Interior Department, I want you to know, had done a pretty good job. And they made, in making that determination that the property had not been used for public park purposes, they did pretty good. But then we had to determine who to sue, locate witnesses, and gather other relevant evidence. Because you see, these private claimants were well connected. They were old families. They had old money. And they had old and established lawyers. And this was not going to be, you know, a little waltz in the park. This was going to be, you know, bare knuckles Donnybrook right from the word go. And if I mentioned the lawyer's names, you would know right away what I'm talking about. The Department of Justice in Washington did help and actually detailed a lawyer down to help. Our object together was to establish in one lawsuit, hopefully for all time, until the mind of man runneth no more, I think. Jim, what's that in property law, in law school? Yeah, until the mind of man runneth no more. So in one lawsuit, we were going to establish that the government had the absolute and primary right, title, and interest to this property against any other person or entity, public or private. So the lawsuit was filed in that same courthouse at Chase and Palafox on January 29, 1971. Named as defendants were these many private claimants, their heirs, estates, and anyone claiming under them. We sued the state of Florida, Gulf Power, because Gulf Power had put their lines across where the state had its right-of-way or where the state thought they had their right-of-way. We sued the Girls and Boy Scouts, make you very popular. We sued dissolved churches, cemeteries, trusts, anybody, any conceivable person or entity that might have some claim to their title. We also made parties. They were parties defended. We sued them. We even got the court to appoint an attorney ad litem to represent any unknown heirs. So if there's anybody out there that we don't know about, we got a lawyer, and he's going to file something with the court. Now, as you can imagine, the filing got a little press. So one morning, shortly after I filed, I got a phone call from a lady in Gulf Breed, lived down the highway, I think. She told me, Mr. So-and-so is digging a road through the Naval Live Oaks Preserved. He got a bulldozer out there. I don't know, okay. So I got in my car and I drove across. I think we had a new bridge at the time. I got down there and sure enough, there was a guy about twice my size on a bulldozer running the road up from that side, north side, coming across. He was heading out because if we won, he was going to be cut off. So I looked at him and I looked at myself, and I was there alone, and I was not about to pick a fight. So I got his name and went back to town and called Washington and said, laid out a game plan for him. So many of you remember a photographer downtown by the name of Ray Malinowski. His office was right across the street from where the present library is on Balin or Spring Street. Ray was in town, I got him, and you remember a private pilot by the name of Dale Warehand. Dale Warehand had an airplane. He was available. That afternoon, you talk about things happening. We got Ray Malinowski, who was not a real skinny guy, and with two of us got in the airplane with Dale Warehand. It was, thank God, a nice day, and we flew out, and literally, this plane was not designed to take pictures. Ray leaned over, and the three of us in that airplane taking pictures of this guy running this road, bulldozing this road right through the Naval Live Oaks. The very property we were litigating, and we filed a notice in the courthouse in Milton, which is notice to the world that there's litigation involving this property. Anybody that deals with it is dealing with it at their peril. So that Saturday, we had an emergency hearing Saturday morning in Judge Arno's chambers, and I had sued the man and got Judge Arno to enter an injunction against him, to have him stop that. So that was quite a ride, that airplane. That was quite a hearing, and I can tell you, nothing was easy in the case. But it was fun, but it wasn't easy. All right, I told you about the state widening the road. Well, our research, and we were doing our own, established that when this state widened this road, some of you were living here at that time. Remember they widened the road? Well, even though the federal government owned the land, they never even gave the government notice they were going to widen the land. So they took about 40 feet plus off the south end of that part of line south of US 98 on the south side of the highway. Took 40 feet at least, and there, of course, that had the effect of limiting even more the use of the land as a public park. Well, the private claimants were well represented, I said, by these experienced lawyers, and they were very seasoned, they were skilled, and even with Judge Arnold holding us all to a very tight schedule, the case took a little while to get ready for trial, but tried we did, and that was in 3 days in May of 1972. Lord, that's a few years ago. Our burden, in case you're interested, was to establish a negative. he had to establish a negative. That is that the property had not been used exclusively for public park purposes. And we showed that through an assortment of local and out-of-town witnesses knowledgeable about what public parks should be, none of which was present at Naval Live Oaks. We called some park people from Virginia and other states to come down, and people skilled in the National Park Service come down and testify, plus some local folks. One of the uses to which the park had been put was an animal park. And on that animal park there was an elephant. And I don't know whether you know this or not, but that elephant has died within your, what is probably now the city limits of Gulf Breeze. Of course, what do you do with the dead elephant? You have no choice but to bury it. So the elephant is buried out there on the property, and we sought to use that as one of the items of proof that it was not used for an exclusive public park purpose, because, you know, animal cemeteries are not used public park purposes. Okay, the other thing that happened that might be of interest to you, because you may know the people, what was the speed limit on 98? Because here we had this road now going through. It was a nice little, I say, when I came in 60, it was, you know, a little 2-lane road. Now it's a 4-lane. All right. We could not get an agreement among the lawyers. They would not agree what the speed limit was. So Betty, sitting out in the audience, Jim, you might remember Gene Bogan. Maybe some of the rest of you may know. Gene Bogan was there covering the trial for the newspaper. So during one of the recesses, and Judge Arno and I both smoked at the time, and so he would go back for a quick smoke. I would ask Gene, I said, you live down the highway. I think you live down somewhere down east of there. I said, what's the speed limit? You drive that thing twice a day, you know, in the morning. And so he told me what it was, and that's what I thought it was. Well, so in the recess I said, Your Honor, I want to call a witness who's not on the witness. Oh man, the other table just erupted, you know. God, you know, he had years to get this case ready. So we were able to convince Judge Arno this is going to be for a limited purpose about a fact. Now, he was not going to give any opinion. So we put Gene Bogan on the stand, and he testified what the speed limit was. So that matter was resolved.
What was it?
I don't remember. Tell me, anybody remember? Was it 55, 65? I don't know. But it was too fast for a public park, because these people that came down from all these states, these people who you know, design and maintain public parks for a living, they were saying, you know, you don't have a high-speed burp. You take it off and you bend it around and you bank it, and you have nice, narrow, and you scenic places you pull off, and you have nice views and all that stuff. But you don't have a 4-lane divided U.S. highway through a public park. That was the point. And so I really don't remember what it was. I'm sure it's in the record. And we fortunately saved the record. You know, I want to tell you something that's happening is that the paper records are being destroyed. They're microfilming them and but we somehow got a hold of this one, kept it out. Well, the case was eventually tried and finished. We got it to Judge Arno, and the ruling came down in July of '72, and it came down in our favor. We had won the case. Judge Arno found that the land had never been developed. There were no restrooms, how about that? No facilities, no beach development, and the land was basically left in an undeveloped state. he found that the scouts were in control and their permission was required for public use. Garbage had been dumped there, no trespassing signs were present, and the pistol range that I talked about earlier had existed. And the previously mentioned elephant graveyard was there. And that formed the basis of a footnote in Judge Arnold's order. And this is footnote 2 of the memorandum decision of July 7, 1972. And I quote, "Counsel for the respective parties, with commendable zeal, have diligently presented the case, both factually and in memoranda of law, to this court. For example, counsel for the United States have unearthed the fact that a dead elephant is buried on this land. The argument is that such animal not being indigenous to the land, the burial means that such was not a use exclusively for public park purposes. This court, concluding the evidence in other respects clearly established such land has not been so used exclusively, leaves this contention undetermined and the elephant undisturbed in its final resting place." And any of you Roman Catholics or otherwise schooled in Latin can help me with this last phrase. Requiescat in pace, which a Notre Dame assistant of mine, Bobby Krongeyer, told me. He said, "Let him rest in peace." That was Bo Arno's footnote on that order about the elephant. So Judge Arno gave the scouts, in that same order, he gave to the scouts, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, the state, and to Gulf Power, time to work out arrangements with us, with the United States, or to vacate the land, vacate their use of the land. So of course we worked out things. And but there was a hotshot guy representing the state road department, and he was strutting around a little bit, and so everybody else was reasonable, and so I said to him, "Ron," I said, "Okay, but I think we ought to be able to work this out." I said, "Because otherwise, when you go back there to Tallahatchie, you're going to have to explain to them when the Interior Department puts a toll booth on that road, on that state highway, how did it happen?" So I said, "You need to get right with us and give us all the stuff that we need, all title, give up your claim, any claim to that land." And so he got pretty reasonable after that, and so we resolved that. So all those pieces fell into line. But the case was not over. I told you about these lawyers being resourceful. They appealed Judge Arno's ruling. The record on appeal consisted of 175 documents, 899 pages, 200 trial exhibits, 15 witnesses transcribed testimony. At that time, this federal court here was in the old Fifth Circuit, which included Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and the Canal Zone. And the headquarters was in New Orleans, very nicely, conveniently in the French Quarter. Tough duty. So, of course, the case was set for oral argument. And all of us had a chance to talk to these three federal judges, the Court of Appeals judges, and those those lawyers on the other side really fought. That was kind of an interesting oral argument. So now that was Judge Arnold's decision came down in July of '72. The Fifth Circuit panel opinion was dated July 12, 1973. And they affirmed Judge Arnold, and I quote, "with a definite and firm conviction that a mistake has not been committed by the trial." That was Judge Arnold. So the case was finally concluded. Title to these 1,377 acres, plus or minus, was now in the name of the United States. Back at that time, the big push in Washington and the Justice Department was to show how much money we were collecting. So we had to submit a report every month, we foreclosed on a mortgage or recovered something we took credit for it. Well, they gave me credit for $500 an acre. So I was given credit for recovering $7 million of property. That was the 1973 valuation of the Naval Live Oaks Preservation from our determination. So that's where the property sits, and I want to tell you that when it became part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore and the interior people came in, they continued to do their very good job, and Mr. Brown and those people, people before him have all done a great job to preserve that piece of property. Jim, in June, I've been a member of the Florida Bar for 58 years. When you and I met, I was in private practice, and I had a few clients. We had a few cases against one another. And then,
you won or both?
Yeah. My other employment has been outlined for you. And I've had, a few cases in my time, 44 years on the bench. Wow. And some cases were fun, some were not so fun. I'm trying to think if one has stuck in my memory more than just perhaps given me more personal satisfaction. And I think it maybe comes from, I suppose being a grandfather has a little bit to do with it, but I belong to a fraternal organization, and one of the lectures that we give to the candidate is this line, and it says, his is a poor ambition that does not long to do some good that shall last beyond the limits of his own life. And so I'm out there, and I was merely just one of those people that was there when all these things were around. So somebody else there could have done as good or maybe a better job. But I was there, and so it fell my lot to do this. But it gives me a great sense of satisfaction that it's going to be there. This title to this land is forever in the sovereign United States of America. And it's going to be there for you and your great-grandchildren, and hopefully until the mind of man runneth no more. So that was my little part in this beautiful piece of land, and of course expanded it out to the island now, and you've got the Gulf Islands National Seashore here and all along the Gulf Coast. So it's I think we're very lucky to have this piece of property, and I want to tell you before I step down, this little book, it's available. It's called the Naval Live Oaks Reservation, and it's published by the Pensacola Historical Society, and it was originally dated spring of '75, but it's this edition I have is 1995. And it gives you some interesting background, and particularly how those live oaks are so essential in shipbuilding. And so the Navy used them and on the prow of the ship and the elbows and on the trees. And of course, you know, if you have been to Boston, you know, Old Ironsides has some wood from the Naval Live Oak here in it. And, you know, the Old Ironsides, the ship's still in commission. And once a year, I think the captain gets it underway and they sail around Boston Harbor and establishes that it's still seaworthy and still in commission. So it has never been retired. But some of your wood there is in that famous ship up in Boston Harbor. So I commend this to you because it gives a little bit more detail and the political intrigue with Andrew Jackson. You know, those of you who follow politics know that he was the guy that really developed the spoils system, and he took care of his friend Mr. Brackenridge. And here's a wonderful letter soliciting to be the first agent on the land. And once the government acquired title
Still
to
in
it.
print?
Huh?
Is it still in print?
What, the letter?
The book you got?
I think so, Betty. I don't know where I got it, but it's.
We'll look for it.
Yeah, it's a good piece, and all the chicanery going on. So you turn on the evening news, folks. That stuff, that's not news. That's been going on. That's been going on since you know, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were like this. So anyway, any questions anybody has? I probably talked you to death on a Thursday evening, and you.
I've got one. The
Yes,
Mr. Hopkins you mentioned, I think he was an attorney. Is that Hopkins Boarding House Hopkins?
No.
Or different. Okay.
How about it? Give me your local guy.
His aunt.
It's Ann? Okay.
His aunt ran Hopkins
Yeah.
Boarding House.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that name offensive?
No, JB and his brother EW.
But EW's still alive.
EW is still alive and is a retired banker. And JB was in that legislature. And there's no way that the University of West Florida was going to be on the Naval Live Oaks somewhere in Escambia County. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I should say, Your Honor, with Highway 98 possibly being expanded and all that, how is the Park Service going to handle this? That'll be an interstate in another 15 years.
You think so?
Yes, sir, I do.
Well, I don't know what they're going to do, but
Call you back into action. That's
out the Barrancas, maybe you'll find me out there. If we can find a priest that'll bury me. Anybody else have any questions? Well, I thank you for letting me.
Your Honor?
Yes,
Which way you say that elephant was buried?
You know, I don't know, but it was out there, you know, and I did tell you some of the colorful people that are out there, and you know, one guy was supposedly a night watchman, and there was a little shanty on the place, but there was a woman in there. I don't think they had the benefit of clergy, but she was there during the day, and or maybe was there during the night, whatever. All those little interesting little tidbits of all the stuff going on down there, and yeah, and you know, these people, and there were substantial families that had substantial interest in that property, and. You know, it can only happen. And, you know, nobody could write this stuff. Some Hollywood writer couldn't make this stuff up. These were absolute wonderful, delightful character, as people were back in those days.
Well,
Thank you all for.
Thank you so much. Another round of applause.